I'm Joseph Kopser and I'm joined by Brett Boyd. Welcome to the latest Gray Line video. This one covers the future of work. You cannot watch the news today to hear stories about a changing planet's workforce inside of a country, or even the fear of people losing jobs, not being able to plug into the economy, or aging populations. We deep dive here into the demographics of what's really happening in society, and we also look at the technologies that are being transformative in terms of how people are working, how they interact, and how employers are hiring, and how people are being hired based on those technologies. So Brett, what is happening in this catalyst of the future of work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is a big, broad category, and it affects a lot of different things. We've chosen the future of work, but we could have equally called this the future of consumption, the future of labor. There are a lot of different ways that we could have approached this, but as you mentioned, there is a huge demographic shift that we'll talk about, and then there is a technological shift, both on the software and the hardware side. And so to briefly summarize each of these, talking about demographics, this isn't broadly known, I find, but there is a huge structural shift in the population of the world that's happening right now. It's actually kind of started in maybe the 70s globally, but the world population has always grown. The metric that the United Nations uses is called fertility rate. It's roughly the average children per woman of childbearing age. 2.1, for example, is the replacement rate, right? So if that's the rate, you're at about a flat population. And you have this bifurcation here of outcomes between the developed and the developing world, essentially. And so in the developed world, right now, the fertility rate is roughly 1.67 across the entirety of the developed world. This is looking at the United Nations data set from 2010 to 2015. While in the developing world, it's more like 4.5, right? So you look at the overall average for the whole world is 2.51 or something like that. So the world population is still growing, but this whole bifurcation between types of economies and what their populations look like has shifted. And population growth is the standard for human history, right? I mean, I think you could maybe make some exceptions around the Black Death of the 14th century, and it depends on what time frames you want to look at. You could potentially look at the world wars of the 20th century, but in general, populations have always grown, and when they don't always grow, or when they are not growing, it has several effects. So first off, you have less people. This is kind of obvious. Second, maybe a little bit less obvious, is your average age increases. But then third, which is probably most impactful, is you have a shift in the ratio between consumers of entitlement and social welfare programs and contributors to those programs. This is another United Nations data point. They call it the potential support ratio, which is a ratio of workers to retirees, essentially. And in this case, we're looking at 65 plus and I think 20 to 65. But the United States, for example, was between, I believe, 6 and 8 in 1950, workers per retiree. Other countries were a lot higher. It's now more like 4, and it's trending towards 2. Japan, interestingly, is at 2.1 right now, so 2.1 workers per retiree. And these systems come out of balance. And again, these aren't unsolvable problems, but it does mean that the old framework that supported these types of populations isn't necessarily something that we can simply maintain going forward here. So this whole demographic issue, I think, is a big deal. And we talked about that, or we talked about the policy and the retiree implications, but there's also a whole consumer products implication and so on. I mean, as your age and family status and so on determines what you buy, right? And the obvious anecdote is the sports car versus the minivan here, but I think there are a lot of different applications, my favorite of which being that many project that in Japan, adult diapers will outsell baby diapers here in the next 3 or 4 years, which is kind of interesting to think about. But that's I guess, my high-level thoughts on demographics, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, essentially now you look at this idea of technology and what it's doing. You can go back in history of the Industrial Revolution and look at what happened when machinery came in to replace individual workers, the Luddites, as they're popularly known as, people who resisted that change. You could go forward almost 100 years and look at what happened when the internal combustible engine put buggy whip makers and carriages themselves out of production and therefore displacing those jobs. But what we are concerned about and make sure people understand is that as these catalysts are changing faster, new technologies are coming online, displacing jobs. And we're not just talking about blue collar or assembly line worker jobs going away. It could also be at the higher end of the technology and skill level. It could be medical diagnosis. It could be legal assistance, replacing those white collar jobs too. And so as you look around the world and you see elections in different countries that are impacted by concerns of people who feel like the market or the economy is leaving them behind and they don't feel like they're plugged in anymore, it's important for big institutions and technology firms that are producing these changes. It's important for public sector who've got to be able to deal with aging populations and fewer people paying into the social safety net. But we also have to think about when jobs like, for instance, in the United States, truck driver is the single most common job in the United States. What happens when autonomous technologies reduce the number of people that need to be driving trucks of all types in our country? These are a lot of important issues to think about in the future of work. So Brett, what else as we close out?
Yeah, and look, there are a lot of different projections around percentage of workers that are going to be displaced by technology. Again, you can find estimates that are close to zero, and you can find estimates that are 50+%. And the point here is not to be fatalistic or alarmist around this, but the point again is to not bury our heads in the sand and pretend like nothing is happening. And again, this applies to businesses from the perspective of hiring and training and worker management. This applies to families in terms of how do I set my children up for success. This applies to public institutions and what's the best way to educate. Because again, we're in a world where skills are being reinvented. I mean, you could almost argue that the skill to learn new skills is more important than any specific skill. And I don't actually know how to translate that into an education framework, but I suspect that will be increasingly important here for people to think about. And so we, again, we think that there are wonderful opportunities emerging here in the future. We're not on the doom and gloom scenario, but we do think that we all need to be thoughtful here as we enter this period of transformation.
It's an exciting time going forward. So whether you are a private company, whether you're a public institution, academia, or just curious about the changing world, these issues like the future of work matter. It's important for you to be able to see these changes, and we help you visualize and know what data to be looking for. We also make sure that when you see it, if you decide to do something about it, the strategy that you develop for your organization to be able to accommodate these catalysts and the changes. And then thirdly, once you decide, how do you implement it? How do you overcome people and the resistance to change to execute the strategies to survive? So we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the future of work. On the Grayline website, we have a number of different topics. Please check them all out and let us know what you think. Thank you very much.